London, 1914. Fog drifted over the Thames as the bells of Big Ben tolled noon. Below the grey sky, ships bearing the Union Jack steamed in and out of port. Coal smoke, steel and pride. A clerk at the Admiralty, George Latham, scribbled figures on a map. 60 naval bases worldwide, 500 million subjects, one empire. The British Empire, as his superior often said, upon which the sun never sets. But deep inside, Latham had begun to notice the tremor of something changing. The British world order, built over centuries, was showing cracks. In the colonies, from India to Africa, voices of self-rule were stirring. In Ireland, rebellion was brewing. Yet what worried Latham most was not rebellion, but rivalry. Across the Atlantic, a younger, hungrier power was rising, the United States of America. In 1914, America was still officially an isolationist nation, but its factories were alive with motion. Ford's assembly lines, Carnegie's steel mills, Rockefeller's oil empire. The rhythm of modern capitalism beat faster there than anywhere else on Earth. While Britain spent gold on battleships, America minted wealth through machines. When war erupted in Europe that summer, the old world tore itself apart. Britain and her allies marched into the trenches of France. The empire called upon its colonies, Indians, Canadians, Australians, to fight for a distant king. The United States watched from afar, neutral yet watchful. American companies sold wheat, uniforms, and weapons to all sides. By 1917, when the U.S. finally entered the war, it was already the banker of the world. In London, George Latham saw the numbers. Britain owed the United States more than $850 million. "We've won the war," he murmured when the armistice came in 1918. "But at a terrible price. We are in debt to our own offspring." After the victory parades, British ministers gathered in Downing Street to plan the peace. They still spoke the language of empire, dominions, mandates, colonies. But across the Atlantic, in the halls of Washington, President Woodrow Wilson spoke of self-determination and a new international order. His idealism was naive to some, visionary to others. Yet it revealed something larger. The center of moral and financial gravity was shifting westward. As Latham walked home one evening through rain-slick streets, he looked up at the Union Jack fluttering over Whitehall and wondered, with quiet dread, has our age already passed? And we just haven't realized it yet. New York, 1920. The streets roared with jazz, motorcars, and money. On Wall Street, men in gray hats shouted prices that made and broke fortunes in seconds. In just 2 years, the United States had transformed from Europe's supplier into the world's creditor. Britain, once the banker of the world, now owed billions to the Americans. The war had left London drained and weary. In India, the Amritsar massacre shocked the conscience of even loyal subjects. In Ireland, revolution erupted. The empire that had ruled continents was bleeding from within. Meanwhile, the United States was intoxicated with its own youth. New York eclipsed London as the financial capital of the world. The dollar quietly began to challenge the pound sterling. In Washington, President Warren Harding promised a return to normalcy. Yet normal had changed. America's factories hummed with unstoppable force. Detroit's automobiles, Pittsburgh's steel, Chicago's meat, California's oil. Every ship that left New York Harbor carried not just goods, but influence. Radios, typewriters, Hollywood films, each spread the American spirit more effectively than any imperial banner. In London's dim offices, George Latham, now older, gray at the temples, followed the news with unease. He had returned from the war believing Britain could still rebuild its greatness through trade and diplomacy. But he saw now that the balance sheets were cruel. The pound was weak, gold reserves dwindling, and unemployment rising. "We fought for civilization," he wrote in a private letter, "and found ourselves its debtor." Then came October 1929, the crash. New York's towers of speculation collapsed in a single, stunning fall. The panic crossed the Atlantic like a plague. British exports dried up. Banks failed. For a moment it seemed both powers might drown together. But America, though wounded, was not finished. Out of the Great Depression rose a new kind of nation. Under Franklin D. Roosevelt, the U.S. reinvented itself through the New Deal. Public works, social security, national recovery. Britain, burdened by imperial commitments and declining industry, could only patch and manage in those years of hardship. The unspoken truth grew clearer. The United States could adapt. The empire could not. As the decade closed, the dark clouds of fascism spread across Europe. Hitler rearmed Germany. Mussolini marched into Africa. Japan eyed the Pacific. The world that Britain once controlled by gunboats was slipping into chaos again. In 1939, war returned, louder, faster, and deadlier than before. And this time, George Latham wrote in his journal a single line that captured the weight of his century. "If Britain wins this war, it will be because America allows her to." Washington, D.C., December 1940. The White House windows glowed against the winter dark. Inside, President Franklin D. Roosevelt leaned over a map of Europe, tracing the Nazi advance. France had fallen, London was burning under the Blitz, and Britain stood alone. Yet Roosevelt's jaw was set, calm, calculating. "We must be," he told his aides, "the great arsenal of democracy." Across the Atlantic, the British Empire had reached its moment of truth. Churchill's speeches roused defiance, but behind the rhetoric lay desperation. Britain had mortgaged its gold, sold its American investments, and still the bills for ships, planes, and food mounted. The Royal Navy guarded convoys through the North Atlantic, but German U-boats sent them to the bottom in fiery silence. The Empire's global reach could not hide its exhaustion. George Latham, now retired and living in Surrey, listened to the BBC's grim reports each evening by the fire. He recognized the pattern of history too well. "We once ruled by our own industry," he confided in a letter to a friend. "Now we rule by American credit." He wasn't wrong. In March 1941, Roosevelt announced the Lend-Lease Act, a lifeline that would change the world's balance of power. Billions of dollars worth of arms, ships, and supplies poured from American factories to Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. "We shall send them everything short of war," Roosevelt said publicly. Yet behind those words, the reality was clear. The United States was already becoming the quartermaster of the free world. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, isolation was no longer an option. America entered the war not as a junior partner, but as the coming leader. Its factories, untouched by bombs, became engines of global war production. 300,000 planes, 100,000 tanks, millions of tons of supplies. The soldiers who crossed the Atlantic wore a confidence the old empires could no longer afford. By 1944, American generals planned invasions. American dollars financed operations, and American ships filled the seas once ruled by Britain's navy. When the war ended in 1945, it was the Stars and Stripes that flew over victory parades in both Europe and the Pacific. London was still standing, but barely. In the summer of 1945, as Churchill's government fell and Britain counted its dead, Latham visited the bombed ruins of the East End. Children played among bricks and rubble. "We survived," he whispered, "but we are not the same." From across the ocean came a new sound, the hum of American bombers returning home, the march of soldiers, the voice of power shifting unmistakably westward. The empire had not fallen by defeat. It had simply been replaced by its own creation. London, 1947. Ration cards still filled the pockets of weary citizens. Coal was scarce, bread was rationed, and the once great capital of empire felt grey and hollow. The Union Jack still flew, but it fluttered over a nation in debt, not dominion. Across the Atlantic, however, the factories of the United States were busier than ever. While Europe rebuilt its cities, America was already building the future. The war had redrawn the world's map, but it was money, not armies, that would determine who led it next. The United States now held 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. Its dollar was strong, its industries unbroken. Britain, by contrast, owed over $4 billion in wartime loans to Washington, debts that would take half a century to repay. George Latham, now an old man, watched these shifts from his modest home in Surrey. "We ruled through colonies," he wrote, "and they rule through credit." His words proved prophetic. In 1947, U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall announced an extraordinary plan. $13 billion in aid to rebuild Europe. It was called the Marshall Plan, and it carried both generosity and calculation. America would feed the hungry, rebuild factories, and revive currencies. But in doing so, it would bind Western Europe to the American economic orbit. Coca-Cola, Ford, and General Electric became as familiar in Paris and Rome as they were in Chicago. Meanwhile, the British Empire began to unravel. India, the jewel in the crown, gained independence in 1947, followed by Pakistan. In 1948, Ceylon and Burma left the imperial fold. The map that once glowed red with British power was fading, yet London still hoped to play the role of mediator between old and new worlds. But events in 1949 changed everything. The Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. China fell to Mao's communists. The world split in two, East and West. And in that division, the United States found its new mission. The Cold War made America the protector of capitalism, freedom, and democracy. The British Empire, too weakened to lead, became the loyal ally, the junior partner. By 1951, U.S. troops fought in Korea under the banner of the United Nations. But everyone knew whose flag truly led the way. American bases appeared across Europe, the Pacific, and the Middle East. Not colonies, but outposts of a global network. The British Navy still sailed, but American aircraft carriers now dwarfed it in might and reach. In one of his last letters, Latham wrote simply, "The empire built by ships and gunpowder has given way to one built by dollars and dreams, and this time the world embraces its conqueror willingly." He would not live to see how right he was. Washington, D.C., 1961. The air crackled with optimism as a young president, John F. Kennedy, stood before the Capitol and declared, "We shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe to assure the survival and success of liberty." The words rolled across a world that no longer belonged to Europe. The age of the British Empire was over. The Pax Americana had begun. From Tokyo to West Berlin, American influence shaped the post-war order through money, media, and might. The Bretton Woods system had made the dollar the world's reserve currency. The World Bank and International Monetary Fund operated from Washington, not London. NATO's headquarters sat in Brussels, but its power radiated from the Pentagon. Even the skies were ruled by American technology. Boeing, Douglas, and later NASA's rockets reaching beyond the atmosphere itself. Britain, though proud, had accepted its new place. The Suez Crisis of 1956 was the final humiliation when British and French troops invaded Egypt to retake the Suez Canal. President Eisenhower forced them to withdraw by threatening economic sanctions. The message was clear. The United States, not Britain, now decided the rules. The empire had become the apprentice. In Surrey, an old man named George Latham listened to the radio reports of Suez with tears in his eyes. He remembered the young clerk he'd once been, mapping the ports and colonies of a world painted red. "We taught them empire," he murmured to his wife. "They taught us relevance. It was neither bitterness nor regret, only recognition." By the 1970s, American culture had become the world's language. Coca-Cola, Hollywood, and rock music replaced the Union Jack as global symbols of modernity. While Britain joined the European Economic Community in 1973, the United States landed men on the moon. The transition was complete. Yet this new empire carried no crown and built no colonies. It ruled through influence, finance, and belief. Through ideas of freedom, consumption, and progress, it was an empire of the mind, one that conquered not by armies but by aspiration. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, many called it the triumph of the free world. But historians knew better. It was also the final act in the long story of imperial succession. The torch once held by Britain now burned in American hands. Brighter, larger, but just as consuming. On a quiet evening, decades after Latham's death, a historian at King's College, London, closed his worn copy of The Decline and Fall of the British Empire and looked out toward the Thames. The river still flowed to the sea, as it had for centuries, carrying memories of ships, empires, and ambition. He whispered the final truth that history had written. The empire did not die. It changed its accent. The story doesn't end here. Next episode, How America Took Over the World. Subscribe and step deeper into the dark side of history. Every empire rises, and every empire falls. But what happened next will shock you. Don't miss the next episode. How America Took Over the World. Subscribe now and join us again as we uncover the secrets that time tried to bury.